Hello and welcome back to the Wandering Cantos. Today we're going to be discussing the new anime/animated film All You Need Is Kill. So, as always, I just want to give a quick spoiler warning. Moving ahead, there's going to be major spoilers for All You Need Is Kill. There might be some minor spoilers for The Edge of Tomorrow. And if you're enjoying this type of content, please don't forget to subscribe and give the video a like. So, my first impressions of this film is that I really enjoyed it. I left the theater, with really a strong positive reception to the film. Right before I entered it, I saw that it was based on the same manga that inspired Edge of Tomorrow, but I wasn't sure how accurate of an adaptation Edge of Tomorrow was since I'm not super familiar with the actual manga and source material. And that's why we're not really discussing the manga in this video. But yeah, so I went into this one not really knowing what to expect. And so as I just mentioned, leaving the theater, I had like this newfound sort of sense of energy. And I love when anime movies sort of have that uplifting moment at the end where, you're going on this grand adventure with these characters. And even though it sometimes ends on a bittersweet note, it sort of revives you in a way and makes you appreciate your own life and, kind of gets you ready to also seize the day in your own way. So the good of this film is that I thought it had amazing animation. I loved the stylistic choices, the flashes of color, the sort of almost like hyper digital, exaggerated animation and proportions and stuff was really cool and just made this, really stunning to watch. In addition to that, I also liked some of the, I guess you would call it like directorial choices. In the beginning, there's like a ton of Dutch angles and sort of just interesting, tricks and, sort of camera play. Going into this movie, I was really hoping it would be colorful. That was sort of the one thing I was like, well, I don't know anything about this movie, but based purely off of the poster, I'm hoping it's one of those action movies where like blood is often depicted as being like a different color than red, and it's sort of like surreal in a way. And as a result, I was not disappointed by this one. In terms of the actual story, I really enjoyed that. I felt like they took the time to give a sort of realistic portrayal of sort of the psychology of being in one of these situations. So, as I mentioned, there's going to be spoilers. So going into it, this is basically, the plot is that there's Rita who's sort of like a mine worker. There's been this alien sort of strange, plant growth in this area of Japan, and as a result, humanity is sort of like mining it for like rare resources and whatnot. And then one day the aliens attack and effectively kill everybody. So Rita, however, as soon as she's killed, wakes up at the start of that day. And so this isn't very much like a unique, at this point, sort of story structure. I'm not sure if the manga for this is one of the first to have done it. Again, I'm not super familiar with the manga, but, we've seen this before. And obviously we've also seen it in, for example, Edge of Tomorrow, which is based on the same source material. But it becomes sort of a loop, almost like a roguelike video game where you're constantly, every time you die, you restart, but you carry over your knowledge from the previous day. So we see Rita try to go through this. And that's sort of always like a daunting story structure to start, I think, because it's sort of, you're asking your audience to go along with effectively watching the same day over and over again. So you have to find ways to make it interesting. But also you have to sort of, think, well, how would that be for my character? What would it be like to suddenly be in this situation where you're looping? And I really appreciate that in this one, we sort of see what I felt like was a pretty realistic portrayal. At first, she tries to warn everybody, she tries to run away, and ultimately she tries to end things on her own terms, hoping that will sort of break the loop, and we get a clear character motivation, which is that, she's trying to end this loop, and ultimately that seems to be the first goal rather than trying to save all of humanity, which is sort of interesting because I don't know, in a way that's sort of realistic, in that, like, these characters aren't going to suddenly be noble heroes who are like, no, I must for the, sacrifice myself for the, the state of humanity and all of that. And it's more about them trying to break the loop, although that gets a little bit more gray towards the end of it. I also felt like this cast had a lot of likable characters. I especially liked Keiji and Shasta, who Shasta's the doctor doctor scientist who sort of helps the protagonist figure out the full extent of their situation. And it was sort of fun because sort of a dark film in a way, because it's so colorful and it's full of action and sort of like fun moments, but there's brevity. And I felt like Shasta was one of those where she's sort of like this manic kind of mad scientist person, but has an energy that's I don't know, different than the typical mad scientist, where she also just seems to be like having a lot of fun with it. And it was just a very likable character. I was sort of sad that this ultimately was a movie and not like a little mini series or something. I also thought there was a really fantastic twist on the final showdown. So basically, this scientist tells them that the three of them, so Rita, Keiji, and this sort of alien life, are all actually linked. And there's sort of going to be a survival of the fittest situation where only the strongest is going to survive, because the alien is going to try to wipe out the other strongest and sort of absorb them into its sort of hive mind collective. And so I was sort of like, oh, well, what's the twist going to be? Is the twist going to be that Keiji was actually the strongest? And, since we're so much closer to Rita in terms of, who the audience sees the story through, I wasn't sure if it was going to go with that angle or what really. And so instead, it ends with Keiji realizing that they've effectively failed. And so he thinks that if he can kill Rita, they'll restart again, and then she will get one more try to do things right. And so he thinks, but the only way to make that work is if he shows the alien life that he's the strongest, because then the alien life will absorb him first instead of Rita. And normally, like, I don't know, I can't think of another time where I've seen a situation like this where the characters actually go through with it. Because, normally it's sort of like, oh my gosh, that means that, maybe I will have to die. And usually the story writes it that the Keiji type character, the friend character, realizes that they just have to sacrifice themselves and throw themselves into the volcano or something like that. But with this one, he realizes he has to actually kill Rita. And so we get this really epic final showdown as they're fighting. And as they're fighting, the alien is actually fusing itself with Keiji. And so the sort of next twist is that when Rita does kill Keiji, and we also realize, as I get ahead of myself, we also realize that Keiji sort of programmed Rita's suit to be able to do this, which means that he had sort of been planning on this as a possibility. But Rita technically wins the fight, but by doing so, she actually eliminates the alien, because the alien was fusing with Keiji during that fight, which then kills the alien and sort of saves the day. And there's sort of a reset in that Keiji now no longer remembers anything, which is a bit confusing as to the total logistics of why, but that's just storytelling and, it's fantasy. But I thought that was just a really fun twist. To discuss the bad, while I really liked the animation style, at times I felt like the art style, specifically the anatomy of the characters, was a bit jarring. It sort of reminded me of like video game art, and I also just felt like there were some scenes where like the characters' eyes felt like they were way too far apart and things like that. That's more up to personal taste and just my own taste in, sort of anatomy styles and art. I wasn't crazy about it. But yeah, it just sort of felt like it was something you would see in the cutscenes of like an indie game, albeit, like a critically acclaimed video game, because it's still really well drawn and, again, fantastically animated, and like things like choice of color and color palette and all that were just excellent. But there was something about the way the characters moved and sort of their anatomy that, again, I felt like I was almost watching like a cinematic trailer for a video game in the beginning. As I watched it, your eyes sort of adjust and you get sort of immersed in the art style, but it was just sort of jarring in the beginning. I also felt like at times Rita was sort of hard to root for. She sort of makes decisions that are just like not necessarily morally bad or morally good, because protagonists don't have to be morally good. There's a lot of discourse about this right now with like Marty Supreme, but I feel like they don't have to be heroes, they don't have to be good guys, but you should still be compelled to watch them and sort of in a weird way be rooting for them. So Rita is by no means a villain or even as complicated as a character like Marty Supreme, but I felt like sometimes her selfishness and her ability to like shut down, and obviously there's a whole fight with her and KG where she sort of like gives up after they realize one thing. They think they have to kill this one alien and then they'll stop the loop. They do it doesn't stop the loop, and then she sort of like immediately shuts down and gives up. So again, not like a moral thing, but at times it's sort of like, oh come on, like as an audience member I had a hard time rooting for her, and I found myself sort of rooting for the other kind of more likable characters like KG and Shasta the scientist and people like that. Also, as a result, with that sort of whole fighting and shutdown thing, why do romance stories always need a scene where the two, quote unquote lovers fight? It's like it's an integral part of the sort of romance story arc where, there's the meet cute, there's the no way, there's them going on dates, and every romance story right before the end, sort of the climax is that they have this huge fight and then they go their separate ways, but then they come back together for, the movie to end on the final kiss or embrace or whatever like that. And it's sort of like it's always sort of annoyed me as a story structure. I'm not really sure why we need to include that, because I usually find that kind of taints the romance. At first, like, oh my god, they're so cute together, I really enjoy seeing the chemistry between these characters, and then if they have this big blow up where they like insult each other a ton, it kind of just makes them feel like a bit more of a toxic relationship than like a purely cute relationship to watch from an audience's perspective. And then some other miscellaneous thoughts. It turns out that it's actually really fun to watch an adaptation that sort of has a totally new twist from other adaptations. And I like that a lot more than a remaster, because I feel like we've been seeing things where movie franchises get rebooted and, they're making another version of a film that's already been out. And usually with those situations, the creative team is effectively just remaking that first movie, but with different actors and maybe better cameras and technology and a few creative choice differences. But for example, with this one, since it's so different from Edge of Tomorrow, it was actually really fun getting to see like the same premise, which is, they both come from the same manga. So we get the same premise and some of the same character names and stuff, but it's a drastically different story. And it's actually a lot more fun in my opinion. I'd much rather that than just seeing remake after remake of the same film. Just to, as I sort of was commenting on earlier, it's always so bittersweet that in anime movies things can never end 100% happily. There's always some twist. So with this one, after KG saves the day sort of by sacrificing himself / fighting Rita, he ultimately doesn't remember anything, and so when they re-meet after this big climactic fight, he doesn't even know who she is. And, it seems like she's going to still hang out with him. She knows that he's sort of lonely and has issues, and but it's weird because, for example, we saw this huge character growth with his character where he gets over sort of doing a fake nervous chuckle laugh and laughing when people are being mean to him, and we see that was sort of a coping mechanism he had from childhood bullying and stuff. And at the end of the movie, he has that habit again because he doesn't remember any of the character growth he got from being with Rita. So, as an audience, we can infer that once the credits roll and they go out on their new adventure, Rita will probably help him grow past that a second time, but I don't know, it's always a little bittersweet. And I want to also emphasize that this isn't like a complaint. This is why it's under the miscellaneous instead of the bad. It's always painful seeing stories end this way, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. And then just my final thoughts. Overall, I really enjoyed this film. As I said earlier, it took me a bit to get sort of into the art style, but once I was immersed in the film, I really enjoyed it. In addition to the art style, again, this premise of watching the same day over and over again, sort of Groundhog's Day situation, I always have a bit of a hard time getting into it. I feel like I just sort of like get a little angsty at first, where I'm like, or antsy, I should say, where it's like, oh, this is going to be boring. But every time I watch it, it always ends up being very entertaining because there's twists and turns, and they know when to speed up things and when to just jump cut past things and whatnot. So I really, really enjoyed it. So my final score for this one is going to be a 8.5 out of 10. I really enjoyed this movie. I definitely am going to want to watch it again. If I was collecting a Blu-ray collection, this would definitely be one I would want to buy, so I had it in the future. Again, it loses a couple points for, I think, sort of the video gamey art style, and again, since it's an adaptation, but it's of something we've already seen before, there wasn't a ton in this that felt like it was like totally unique and my first time seeing it ever, so it loses a few points for that, but I still give it a very high score. So yeah, that's gonna about wrap this up. Thanks for watching. So now this is where I sort of turn it to you, the audience. Wondering, have you had a chance to check out this movie yet? And if so, what are your thoughts? I'm kind of curious if I could hear in the comments, how did you like the sort of twist that there was a change in protagonist and that this one we were focusing on Rita rather than Keiji? Did you like the sort of design of the aliens? I've seen some discourse. Some people like that they look more plant-like. Some people really don't like that. So sort of what's your opinion on that? And yeah, once more, I just wanted to say, if you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and giving the video a like. But beyond that, thanks, take care, and I will see you in the next one.